We're diving right into a notoriously complex and frankly defining chapter in human history, the Crusades. We're talking about a span of roughly 200 years that acted like this massive, bloody geopolitical pendulum, swinging fiercely back and forth between East and West. It's a period that completely redrew borders, blended cultures in unexpected ways, and ignited a clash of civilizations with echoes we can absolutely still feel today. So to untangle this dense era, we're going to break this continuous cycle of action and reaction down into 6 clear parts: the spark of holy war, the First Crusade, Crusader States and trade, the rise of Saladin, chaos and the Fourth Crusade, and finally, the fall and legacy. All right, Section 1, the spark of holy war. Okay, let's dive into this. Transport yourself back to the mid-11th century. The Mediterranean world at this point is this deeply fractured landscape. You've got Catholic kingdoms in the west, the Orthodox Byzantine Empire in the east, and a massive Islamic world stretching all the way from Persia to Spain. Now, you might be wondering, how did a simple plea for military help in the middle of all this spark 2 full centuries of continuous holy war? Well, it really comes down to the desperate Byzantine emperor, Alexius I. He was looking at the very real possibility of losing his empire to rapidly expanding new powers in the region. So he made a fateful appeal to his Catholic neighbors in the west for some military backup. Just watch how these geopolitical dominoes fall. Back in the 1040s, a nomadic people known as the Seljuk Turks arrived in Persia, and by 1055, they had quickly captured Baghdad. But the real catalyst? That happened in 1071, when the Seljuks handed the Byzantine Empire a catastrophic defeat at the Battle of Manzikert. Losing territory incredibly fast, Emperor Alexius pleaded for help, and in response, Pope Urban II convened the Council of Clermont in 1095. But here's the twist. He didn't just ask knights to go help the Byzantines. He added his own wildly controversial objective to reclaim the holy city of Jerusalem, offering the remission of sins for anyone willing to take up the cross. Moving right along to Section 2, the First Crusade. With cries of "God wills it," the mobilization kicked off. But the reality of this first wave, it was vastly and tragically different from the highly organized military expedition the Pope actually had in mind. Well before the professional armies could even assemble, a completely disorganized mob of tens of thousands of peasants just set out in early 1096. This was led by a preacher named Peter the Hermit. Known as the People's Crusade, this rogue faction marched east, and on their way, they initiated horrific violence against Jewish communities in Europe, an event we now call the Rhineland Massacres. When this ragged mob finally stumbled into Anatolia, they were promptly and quite predictably totally annihilated by Seljuk forces at Sivet. Now, what's really interesting here is the economics of it all. By autumn of 1096, the official, heavily armed First Crusade finally got moving. But just think about the mind-boggling financial reality of outfitting 100,000 people for a cross-continental expedition. Knights literally pledged their estates as collateral to monasteries just to get the upfront cash. In Old French, this arrangement was called a mortgage, which literally translates to a death pledge. If they died in battle, their land was forfeit. Yep, this medieval financing strategy is the direct origin of the modern mortgage we use today. So, back to the action. This massive, officially sanctioned force fought its way straight through Anatolia, laying a brutal 7-month siege to Antioch, eventually taking it thanks to an insider's betrayal. By June 1099, the surviving army, which was now reduced to just 12,000 men, arrived outside Jerusalem. After a grueling 5-week siege, on July 15th, they breached the walls, and what followed was a vicious, indiscriminate massacre of the city's inhabitants. It was a violently dark, yet undeniably militarily successful climax to the First Crusade. Which brings us to Section 3, Crusader States and Trade. All right, so with Jerusalem captured, the Crusaders had to figure out what to do next. Surrounded by vastly larger Muslim powers, they dug in and established permanent, albeit highly vulnerable, roots. These newly conquered territories were collectively called Outremer, which just means overseas. You've got the County of Edessa, the Principality of Antioch, the County of Tripoli, and of course, the most prestigious of them all, the Kingdom of Jerusalem. Now, to defend these incredibly isolated feudal states, 2 of the most powerful medieval military institutions were born, the Knights Templar and the Knights Hospitaller, and they built immense, imposing castles to guard these new frontiers. But survival required a lot more than just warrior monks. It required massive logistics. Italian maritime republics like Venice and Genoa stepped up to provide the ships needed to supply the Crusader armies. Yet trade is a two-way street, right? These exact same Italian ships brought highly sought-after exotic goods, like silk and spices, back to Europe. And even more importantly, this literal lifeline sparks a huge transmission of knowledge. We're talking about advanced Islamic medicine, mathematics, and philosophy flowing straight back into a European continent that had largely forgotten it.
That sets the stage for Section 4, the rise of Saladin.
So, despite this thriving trade, the Crusader states were still fundamentally vulnerable, and that geopolitical pendulum I mentioned earlier, it began its massive swing back. Following the fall of Edessa in 1144 and the resulting humiliating failure of the Second Crusade, a massive power void opened up. Stepping into that void was a figure of exceptional political intelligence and tactical genius, Saladin. By brilliantly uniting Egypt and Syria, Saladin completely surrounded the Crusader states. In 1187, he lured the Crusader army into the desert, handed them a decisive defeat at the Battle of Hattin, and captured Jerusalem. Though notably, he chose to spare its inhabitants. This pivotal moment sparked the Third Crusade, pitting Saladin against some truly legendary European monarchs, most famously the brilliant English tactician, King Richard the Lionheart. Now, the Third Crusade ultimately yielded a pretty mixed bag of results. The Holy Roman Emperor Frederick Barbarossa actually drowned en route, and the French King Philip II decided to just pack up and go home early. Richard the Lionheart, however, pressed on. He successfully captured Cyprus and Acre, dealing some really significant defeats to Saladin along the way. But he just didn't have the manpower to take and hold Jerusalem itself. Ultimately, both sides reached a compromise with the 1192 Treaty of Jaffa. It expanded Crusader coastal territories, but crucially, left Jerusalem firmly in Muslim hands.
Let's roll into Section 5, Chaos and the Fourth Crusade.
As we cross into the 13th century, this whole crusading ideal begins to morph dramatically. It increasingly turned inward, resulting in absolute chaos across Europe and the Mediterranean. The sequence of events in the Fourth Crusade is an almost comical yet profoundly tragic example of this. Initially aiming for Egypt, the Crusaders assembled in Venice in 1202. But guess what? They were incredibly short on funds and couldn't pay their transport bill. So, to defer the debt, the Venetians somehow convinced them to sack the Christian city of Zara. Then, a deposed Byzantine prince comes along and offers them an absolute fortune to restore him to the throne in Constantinople. They divert there, but when the prince inevitably can't pay up, the Crusaders just brutally sack Constantinople in 1204. They essentially destroyed arguably the greatest Christian city on earth at the time. You literally couldn't write a wilder script. Okay, let's pivot to a completely different approach with the Sixth Crusade in 1229. This one was led by the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II. And get this, he was actually excommunicated by the Pope at the time. Frederick was a fascinating guy. He fluently spoke Arabic and deeply admired Islamic science. So rather than fighting, he looked at the fragmented political situation in the region and used pure diplomacy to secure the return of Jerusalem, Bethlehem, and Nazareth to Crusader control. No bloodshed. It was an absolute anomaly for the era. Finally, we reach Section 6, the Fall and Legacy. Unfortunately, diplomatic victories were incredibly short-lived. Why? Because massive, completely unprecedented external forces arrived on the scene to tip the scales for good. Enter the Mongol disruption. Genghis Khan's successors swept across the Eurasian steppe with terrifying speed. In 1258, they sacked Baghdad, abruptly ending the 500-year-old Abbasid Caliphate. This unstoppable wave of conquests displaced thousands of people, radically scrambling the entire geopolitical landscape of the Middle East, and brought immense pressure down upon literally everyone, Christian and Muslim alike. And out of all this chaos rose the ultimate undoing of the Crusader States, the Mamluks. These guys were highly trained former slave soldiers who had successfully overthrown the Sultanate in Egypt. In 1260, the Mamluks achieved the unthinkable. They actually halted the Mongol advance at the Battle of Ain Jalut. And with the Mongols repelled, the Mamluks turned their full, formidable attention back to the Crusader states, systematically dismantling their castles and territories piece by piece. And this brilliantly illustrates the final blow. By the spring of 1291, the Crusaders were pushed all the way back to their very last major stronghold, the coastal city of Acre. The Mamluk Sultan arrived right outside the city walls, bringing with him a completely overwhelming force of 60,000 men. That is a staggering number for a medieval siege. After a bitter, exhausting 6-week siege, the Crusaders were fought down to the absolute last man, and Acre fell. The remaining coastal towns surrendered very shortly after. This specific moment in 1291 officially extinguished the Crusader presence in the Holy Land. An entire era came to a close after almost 200 straight years of continuous bloodshed, wild cultural exchange, and constantly shifting borders.
As our source material beautifully summarizes, the rise of the Ottomans would rekindle the embers of holy war, resulting in a new conflict emerging between Christianity and Islam. See, the end of the Crusades wasn't really the end of the tension at all. It was merely a transition. The pendulum just kept swinging. A newly emerging Islamic power, the Ottoman Empire, began expanding, setting off a near mirror-image struggle, where Catholic Europe would now be the one desperately fighting to hold off an advancing force.
So I'll leave you with this to ponder. How did this medieval, 200-year clash of civilizations precisely lay the geopolitical and cultural groundwork for the subsequent 400 years of Ottoman Christian conflict?